Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on what part of the day it is. It is Monday, December 10th. It's great to be here. And in our readings today, we're going to address and complete the book of Philemon. We're also going to introduce the book of Philippians, another letter which Paul wrote while imprisoned in Rome. And these are, of course, part of those prison letters. Philippians, we aren't really sure whether it was written early or late, but nonetheless, let's dig into them and see what Paul has to say here today. First of all, Philemon, which is a very short book in the Bible, was a wealthy man of Colossae, and he became a Christian while Paul was there along with his wife and son. And in actuality, we come to find out from Paul that um, his home, Philemon's home, actually becomes one of the first places where the new church gathered in Colossae. So he probably had heard Paul preach, and nonetheless was a convert. Onesimus, which means useful or profitable, was his slave. So Philemon was the master, and at some point we could guess, and this is just speculation, that either Onesimus heard Paul at some time or saw the change that had taken place in his master upon his conversion. Because whatever happens, Onesimus runs away, ends up in Rome, and hits rock bottom, so to speak, before coming in contact with Paul, and Paul ends up taking him in, and he becomes a great support to Paul. And as Paul is now sending Onesimus back with this letter, he's speaking to Philemon about this change that's happened to Onesimus, and how in reality he is no longer a slave, he is a brother in the Lord, and what that means. And so what Paul is describing for Philemon, as we've been talking about the light of Christ and the difference between living in the light and living in the darkness, what Paul is describing here for Philemon is when someone comes to faith in Christ, the gospel and the light of the gospel does away with or changes the entire structure of the old system under which we live. And so Paul is being very tactful. He would love to tell Philemon, well, now you got to take Onesimus back, and you've got to not make him a slave, and he's got to be a brother and serve together with you in the Lord. But even Paul here has to be restrained because he is under the gospel. And there's no room in the gospel for coercion of love, for commanding love, and doing what's right. Those things must happen freely. And that's what makes the gospel so unique, and just the opposite of the law, in that it is the love of Christ in us that empowers us and persuades us to do what is right. However, Paul does emphatically encourage Philemon to consider carefully what this new relationship with this one-time slave should be. So this letter, just like Ephesians, Colossians, and Philippians, comes from Paul, who at this point has his health deteriorating. He's aged rapidly through all of his trials and struggles. And he, in reality, knows that he's never going to be getting out of there, even though he encourages them by saying, gee, he'd love to have an opportunity to visit with all of them there at Colossae, and would like them to keep a spare room ready for him. But again, those are really words of encouragement for that church. Even at this moment, Paul is thinking about those folks there. So that's Philemon. And in Philippians then, again, we see Paul writing this other letter, sends it with Epaphroditus. And if we could say that Corinthians, on the one hand, was Paul's most difficult church to work with, then Philippians, on the other hand, was the easiest and least troublesome church for Paul to deal with. The whole letter speaks about Paul's love for them. In fact, in chapter 4, verse 1, he speaks of them as his joy and crown. So in this letter, what Paul describes is what a healthy, vibrant church that takes seriously its relationship to Christ as the bride of Jesus Christ looks like. And in Acts 16, we have this account of Paul making that first visit to Philippi. Later, he would visit twice more, once 5 years later and once a little later than that, I believe. The letter is written in part in gratitude for a gift, another gift sent by the church to Paul. It's also written at a time where Epaphroditus, whom the Philippians had sent to serve Paul, became ill. Paul is sending him back now to the folks at Philippi, and so he takes this opportunity to also write a letter of encouragement to them and send it back with Epaphroditus. And so there are two additional thoughts that I would share with you today as we get started in Philippians. They're not really the ones that typically we speak about when we talk about Philippians, but nonetheless, two things that occur to me, especially after we've gone through Ephesians recently. First, it's worth noting how, at least in this case in Philippians, Paul, who is often thought of to be down on women, here has brought women in place in leadership at this church in Philippi. If you remember, Lydia, the dealer in purple cloth, was actually the first convert in this church. We also have Yodia and Syntyche, and they were obviously leaders as well. So women have a high place in this church. So if you're going to argue that somehow Paul's against women or down on women and doesn't want to include them in the ministry, Philippians flies in the face of that. The second thing is the Philippian church in Macedonia, though not wealthy by any stretch, nonetheless are a great example of how a church should be. So connected to the church at large, beyond their own community, in mission, assisting Paul, providing gifts for others. They really give us a picture of what it means to be a faithful, living community of believers. And so there's much that, as we read over the next couple of days, we can draw from Philippians that will be of great value to us. And Paul's going to express some of those great things that he appreciates about this church. So, great thoughts for today. Hope you enjoy the reading, and love again, as always, to hear from you, and God's blessings to you. We'll talk to you again soon.